Can low alcohol beers also be enjoyable to drink? Well, that's what I tried to do with my version of an English ordinary bitter. Stick around and see how it turned out. Spoiler, this one's pretty good. Well, I appreciate you stopping by Cascades Homebrew. My name is Brent. Well, it seems like the historic English brewers, well, they didn't hire the best marketing team. They came up with names like mild ale, brown ale, pale ale, old ale, bitters. We're just going to ignore that entire butt label for today. So the beer I tried to brew is an English ordinary bitter. Well, it's not really that ordinary, at least it's hard to find in the United States. It's also not really that bitter, especially compared to like American IPAs or even American pale ales. So in the BJCP style guidelines, ordinary bitter is the lowest AB version of the 3 different English bitters. Above that is also best bitter and strong bitter. For an ordinary bitter, the guidelines call for an ABV around 3.2 to 3.8%. Since I wanted a nice sessionable beer, I definitely wanted to go for the lower end of that scale. So part of my motivation for brewing this beer was the Brew Club's average brew recipe for this quarter. So the Brew Club is an online brew club. They're associated with the Brewlosophy group. For the last 3 quarters, they voted on a style and also the structure of the recipe. So I did brew the American Pale Ale, which was the first one. I didn't get to brewing the New Zealand Pilsner. This time, I'm brewing the average brew ordinary bitter. Next quarter is an oatmeal stout. I hope to do that one too. So looking at the recipe outline for the ordinary bitter, it laid out some options for the grain bill, from the hops, and also some other parameters. I used that to help drive my recipe. It drove to maybe a little bit more of a complex grain bill than I might have otherwise. It also made me use some Fuggle Hops. I'm not sure I'm the biggest fan of Fuggle Hops, but I do appreciate that kind of earthy character that they can add to an English style beer. So I also want to say thanks to Imperial Yeast. I've never actually used Imperial Yeast before this batch. I've heard lots of good things about them, so I think just some of the shops around my area here on the East Coast, it's been a little bit slow to stock up on a good selection of Imperial Yeast. Well, I was selected in a drawing in the Brew Club, and Imperial Yeast direct mailed me a fresh pack of A09 pub yeast. I was excited to give this one a try, and I figured with the high cell count in the Imperial Yeast packs, I could direct pitch this one into my low gravity wort without worrying about making a starter. So as I mentioned, the beer style for this one was an ordinary bitter, style 11A. I went for a full 5.5 gallon into the fermenter batch. Calculated bitterness was around 30 IBUs and color around 11 SRM. So if you watch some of my other videos, you know I often brew 2.5 gallon batches on my stovetop. Also, when I'm brewing 5 gallon batches, I often split them with 2 yeasts. Well, in this case, I just brewed a straight up 5.5 gallon in the fermenter, try to target 5 gallons into a keg batch that I fermented just with the 1 yeast. So a little while back, I upgraded from my 10 gallon kettle to a 15 gallon kettle that has a ball valve. I'm still kind of working out some of my process and hitting my numbers for my equipment profile. So I came up with a recipe targeting around a 75% efficiency, targeting an original gravity of 1035, an estimated final gravity of 1010, which gave me a 3.2% ABV. So for this one, Beersmith estimates my original gravity, IBUs, and color on the upper half of the style guidelines, and then my ABV on the lower end of the guidelines. So with the water on this one, starting with my tap water, my goal is to just kind of bump up some of the mineral levels, bump up that sulfate level, say to around 150, in this case 144 was the calculated number, then the chloride about half of that, and then that would also help me boost up my calcium level a bit. So to adjust my tap water, I need to add 1.2 milliliters of lactic acid to target a pH around 5.4. I don't think I actually took a measurement in this batch. That also needed 6 grams of gypsum and 2 grams of calcium chloride. I also added a little bit of potassium metabisulfite, kind of the same thing as Campton, to help remove chlorine and chloramine. So the grain bill for this one, driven a little bit by the average brew style guidelines, was 87% of Crisp Marris Otter. That was 7 pounds or 2.7 kilograms. I also had 8% of crystal malt, 40 Lovibond, so that was 0.55 pounds or about 250 grams. So it's 2.9% of a biscuit malt from Murphy and Brewed. That was 0.2 pounds, or about 90 grams. Also 2.2% of chocolate malt was 450 Lovibond. So that was 0.15 pounds, or 68 grams. The goal of the chocolate malt was just to bring up the color a little bit. I'm not quite sure it was needed, but we'll see when we get to the tasting. The goal was a 60-minute mash at 145 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 68 degrees Celsius. This one will also get a 60-minute boil. Once the mash was complete, I used my pulley to lift out the grain bag. Since I've got these gloves, I've been doing more squeezing of the grain bag. I think it's helped boosted my efficiency a few points. Once the wort was up to boiling temperatures, I added my 60-minute hop addition, which was 0.6 ounces or 17 grams of East Kent Goldings to have around 11 IBUs. At the 20 minutes left in the boil, I added 1 ounce or 28 grams of Fuggle Hops to add about another 11 IBUs. With 5 minutes left in the boil, I added 1 ounce of East Kent Goldings or 28 grams and also added a tablet of Werflock and some yeast nutrient. And then at flame out, I added another 1 ounce or 28 grams of East Kent Goldings. It was then time to chill the wort down to pitching temperatures. This kettle is quite wide, so much of my jaded hydro chiller is above the wort. I feel like this kettle is just urging me to brew larger batches. I might have to give that a try. This time of year, my groundwater is pretty warm here in Virginia, so after circulating some ice water through the chiller, I was able to get down to my target temperature. So I recently picked up this filter bag for my Monster fermenter. It's designed for holding dry hops or fruit additions, so I thought it might be a great solution for filtering out hop matter to prevent too much going into the fermenter. Well, it did not work the greatest. Seems like it's a bit too fine, and the combination of the trub and the hop matter kind of clogged up the filter. But I managed to get the wort transferred into the fermenter. So then I went ahead and pitched my 1 pack of Imperial Pub yeast A09. I direct pitched it without a starter. I figured that just given the cell count in the packs, a direct pitch in 1 pack into low gravity beer would work fine. Man, that pub yeast sure is chunky. So like I mentioned, I'm still tuning in my values for this new kettle setup. I came in a bit high on gravity at around 1040. Yeah, that's still pretty low, but my target was 1035. My calculator said that adding a 3-liter bottle of spring water would get me back to my target gravity. So that's what I did. I went ahead and added that before fermentation started. And around 24 hours after pitch, fermentation was rocking along. So the fermentation for this one, I started it around 66 degrees Fahrenheit or 19 degrees Celsius. As fermentation started slow around day 4, I rose the temperature up to 70 degrees, 21 degrees Celsius. It was on day 13 that I got around to transferring this one into a keg. Looking at the stats on this one, my efficiency came up a little high at 79%. Maybe my original gravity was on target at 1035, but I had more volume. The attenuation was pretty much on target, 78%, final gravity of 1011, so I finished with an ABV of 3.1%, which was just below my 3.2% target. Since I had more volume in the keg, I ended up filling the keg right up to the gas post, where it flowed out a little bit out of the gas line. I went ahead and dumped a little of the beer out of the keg just to make sure there was headspace in the CO2 so it would fully carbonate. I also went ahead and saved off a few jars of harvested yeast. I'm hoping I might be able to use this in a future batch, though I still have a bunch of dry yeast packets around. I need to make sure I'm using those up as well. So there's how the beer turned out. It's quite a pretty looking beer, nice color. It's got hanging on to a bit of a chill haze. I thought about trying to treat it with some gelatin. I've never used gelatin in beer before. I thought it might be good to try it out. I'm not that worried about the haze, but I think it would look nicer if it was crystal clear. Oddly, because when the wort was transferring into the keg, it was crystal clear at that point. Some of it might be just kind of how I transfer into the fermenter. My other video talked about trub versus no trub, where the one with a lot of trub turned out nice and clear, where the one that had no trub turned out kind of hazy, kind of like this one. So the beer's been in the keg for right about a month. So over the camera down here, it's picking up a good picture. It's definitely a kind of a dark golden color, maybe a little bit darker than I wanted, but not too dark. And the grain bill is that Marris Otter, some biscuit malt, and then the crystal. And then that chocolate malt kind of was in there to add a little bit of color. I think that chocolate malt either could be scaled back or maybe even just skipped. If we go in for aroma, it's just got a lot of what I think of kind of a classic English style kind of pub ale. It's got a little bit of the kind of earthy character from the hops, a little bit of kind of that maybe fruity yeast character. I think I get a little bit of kind of floral character, which I think maybe the East Kent Golding. You get some malty character in there as well. Taking a taste of this. So the first thing that really hits me is just that grain character, both a little bit of a kind of a sweet malty and also a lot of kind of biscuity character that kind of sits with you on the tongue as it sits. So the mouthfeel on it I think is appropriate. I mean, it's probably on that light, medium light kind of a scale, but it's not watery. It's appropriate and it fits in well with the style. Bitterness level on it is, pretty low, although I've had some people say, yeah, it's kind of bitter. So I like fairly bitter American beers. This one's not up there, but I think it's probably appropriate for the style. So overall thoughts on the beer, it's really nice. Say, I like sessional beer, so it's nice to be able to drink a pint and not feel like, oh man, I can't drink any more beer tonight. I think the only negatives would be, does it fit into the ordinary bitter style? I think maybe it's got a little bit too much kind of that biscuity, nutty, kind of mid-level grain character. So I think some of that is from the biscuit malt on top of the Crisp Marris Otter. I've always found Crisp Marris Otter by itself adds quite a bit of that kind of biscuity, maybe a slight kind of nutty grain character, that kind of bread crust character that you're looking for in English beers. So I think the combination of both of those adds a little bit too much. And then I think you get a little bit more from just that little bit of chocolate malt that's in there. The color, I mean, it's a pretty looking color. I don't know if he needed to add something to make the color darker. I might have went for a little bit of a darker crystal malt. That last special bitter I made, I think it was just crystal malt and then an English pale ale malt. I think that's a pretty good combination, but I think adding in the biscuit malt or maybe a little bit of chocolate malt if you want, those are fine options. I think the hop bill on this one worked out pretty well. Like I think it's got an appropriate level of bitterness. I do get that East Kent Golding hop character that I like. Maybe a little bit of an earthy character from the Fuggle, but it doesn't really stand out to me. So if you're like me and you enjoy flavorful, sessionable beers, this would be a great one for you to brew. And if you're interested in more of my content, make sure you hit that subscribe button. And if you enjoyed the video, make sure you give me a thumbs up. Cheers!